Cool, got a new beer. Gonna jump right back into the last video. No, there's not even time for the intro. Previous video, Ashley, where were we? So now that we know that gender identities can exist outside the binary, let's explore that more. Ah, that's right. Okay, so now that we know that gender identities can exist outside the binary, let's explore that more. Caitlin, can you tell me more about terms like gender queer, gender fluid, androgynous, and Demi Girl and Demi Guy?
So I want to start off by saying gender can be confusing. It was for me. It was a huge process. It was years in the making for me to figure out exactly why I wasn't comfortable with the way that I identified. And that's okay. That's just something that comes with the territory. I'm going to talk about the two things that I personally identify as. That is genderqueer, androgynous. So genderqueer is anything that doesn't fall into the traditional gender roles or gender binary. Genderqueer is kind of thought to be synonymous with non-binary, but you can identify as non-binary and not identify as being genderqueer. They're not automatically grouped together. You're not automatically falling under this umbrella term, which is what it is. I could just be androgynous without identifying as genderqueer, but genderqueer is something that I like to identify with. The same way as anybody within lesbian, gay, bisexual spectrum can identify as queer, because it all falls under the queer spectrum, or you cannot identify as queer. Totally up to you. So, yeah. And the discussion of genderqueer brings me to androgyny, which is where I fall comfortably in my identity. So physical androgyny is when you mix like female-male characteristics. You'll often hear it talked about people in androgynous fashion, androgynous clothing. It's kind of a middle line, which is how I like to look at it. Psychological androgyny can mean that you identify somewhere between the male and female range of gender, or that you don't fit into either category. That is totally fine, and that is where I sit in the gender discussion. I feel very comfortable in the middle ground, and I've always been very comfortable with that. Gender fluid refers to someone whose gender varies and isn't fixed. Situational gender fluidity means that if you're working out, you feel very masculine and your gender changes while you're in that particular situation. It could mean one day you feel 70% male, one day you feel 70% female. It changes on a day-to-day basis. One of the other major ones that I came across when I was researching gender identities, trying to figure myself, was Demi Girl or Demi Guy. Now, I'm going to talk about this all wrapped in one package because the terms are pretty similar. So, when somebody is a demi-girl or guy, it means that they only partially identify with a gender, but don't necessarily identify with another gender. An example could be a female assigned at birth who doesn't fully identify with being female, but doesn't feel a dysphoria attached to it.
That is so cool! I didn't know this word before this video, but I love it, I felt it, and I'm happy it's an identity that others connect to as well. I personally have never felt like a man, but I definitely have had moments where I've lacked a really strong connection to a female identity. I'm fluid in this way, sometimes feeling like a woman, sometimes feeling kinda genderless, and sometimes feeling like a combination of those two things. So, demi-girl. Cool! I love it! Moving on, Olivia, I hear you know a bit about the terms agender, gender neutral, gender variant, and Neutrois.
Biological sex is also a spectrum, and the term intersex is used to describe anyone's body that doesn't fit the socially accepted characteristics of male or female anatomy. But remember that sex and gender are different things, so people who are born intersex can have any gender identity. Gender variant is a term used to describe anyone who doesn't conform to the stereotypical gender roles of their society. So even though the term is sometimes used interchangeably with transgender or non-binary, not all gender variant people feel that their gender identity doesn't align with their sex assigned at birth. A good example of this would be a tomboy, who identifies as female but expresses gender in stereotypically masculine ways. So the prefix a in agender implies lack of a gender, and that's how some agender people define the term. And others will define it as more gender neutral. And it's important to note that gender is a super personal thing, so the way that these labels are defined can vary from person to person and identity to identity. So I'm constantly figuring out my gender, which is totally fine, by the way, but right now I feel most comfortable labeling it as agender or gender neutral, which I define as neither male or female. Neutrois is another non-binary gender identity that is commonly defined as gender neutral, genderless, or neither male or female. Many, but not all people who identify as Neutrois often feel the need to transition to a neutral gender. gender so that their body physically reflects their gender identity. Transition meaning anything from pronouns, hairstyles, and clothes to hormones or surgery. And of course, transitioning to a neutral gender is not just for people who identify as Neutrois. So I think it's also important to note that besides robots and shapeshifters, much of the mainstream representation of non-binary individuals is of people like me. Androgynous kids with undercuts, basically. And while it's completely fine to identify and express gender like this, it's also important to note that some people's gender identities and expressions don't line up. And expressing gender in stereotypically masculine or feminine ways doesn't make anyone less trans or less non-binary.
Wow, to be honest, I am learning a ton, but most of these words I have heard before. What about some really, really unique gender identities, like bigender, trigender, third or other gender, and two-spirit? Chase?
Two-spirit individuals is become an umbrella term in the indigenous North American community mostly, and that basically describes anybody who is gender variant. So people who don't identify themselves as male or female, and they're strictly in the indigenous community. So if there's somebody who's in this community and identifies as something completely different than male and female, then they would be identified as two-spirit, or they would identify themselves as two-spirit. When looking at definitions online and looking at people who've talked about their experiences who are in this community and who identify themselves as two-spirit, there's a lot of difference in the community. So there's some people who either dress male and female and assume the roles of both genders. There's some that are just masculine females, masculine males, but identify themselves as two-spirit. There's some feminine men and feminine women, and it's like all over the gender spectrum, and these individuals can identify themselves as two-spirit no matter where they stand, as long as they're gender variant, like as long as they identify themselves as gender variant. Bigender is when an individual goes between feminine and masculine traits and roles, and they move towards them, so they can identify themselves as bigender because they don't strictly identify as one, even if they are female and they can dress feminine in the way society sees femininity. They can still identify as bigender as long as they are, like, they identify themselves as bigender, and that is really usually the process of an individual just moving towards both traits and both identities and just navigating that entire spectrum. Trigender is much like bigender, so it's an individual that moves between feminine and masculine traits and roles, but trigender includes another gender. So it could include a third gender or just an other as a gender. So it's a mix of bigender and it's a mix of third gender. So those two together make trigender. So it's an individual who can either identify as male, female, or other, and who navigates all of these different identities and moves through these traits and through these roles that, you know, society and culture has constructed for us.
Okay, I think I get it. Bigender people identify with or move between both ends of the gender spectrum. Third or other gender people identify with a totally different gender, and trigender people identify with or move between all three of these things. Wow. Is there just an umbrella term I can use for all of this? For everything that isn't cis?
Non-binary is one of the most common used terms for people who are gender variant. Non-binary has become an umbrella term which encompasses many of the identities that we've talked about here. So it can identify and include people who are bigender, people who are gender variant, people who are androgynous, trigender, and everything else that goes under there. Usually, it goes like non-binary, and then there's trans people. So some trans people do identify as non-binary, some non-binary people identify as trans, which is completely fine. Just usually non-binary includes all of the other identities that the individual might not identify themselves as trans, but they know that within them they don't identify as one strict gender. So they either move beyond genders, between genders, around genders, different genders, and all of those great identities are under that non-binary umbrella.
Whew, so much learning. I'm a little exhausted, but I love it. I think the moral in all of this is diversity is an infinite thing, and labels are fantastic, but they can mean totally different things to different people. Because identity is hella personal. If you think anything in the series is misrepresented or misexplained, please leave a comment. And as for future ABCs of LGBT episodes, Let me know what you would like to learn about. And fun fact, next time you see me in a video, the background will be different because I'm moving in a few days. Okay, bye! Follow me on Twitter!
I've been asked on behalf of Ashley to have you subscribe and like. Pretty please for me. Like for me, please like for me. Pretty please for me, I'll give you fake money.
Hey Ashley, first off, just want to say a quick hi and thank you for inviting me to be part of this awesome series of videos. I've watched the first one because I'm kind of a fan of you, so that's weird.